blockchain. Talk about that a little bit, and climate change. And something you mentioned, which I think gets taken out of context, the media just loves to do, is space mirrors. Explain space mirrors. It's not the craziest thing.
So much to unpack there, Karen.
Right. Let's go with climate change. There's not a lot of investment in Silicon Valley for climate change. They'll spend more time investing in, say, scooters than they will on major issues of climate change. I think only Elon Musk and Bill Gates have significant investments in climate change technology.
And I think this is one of the biggest legitimate knocks on Silicon Valley, is that the problems that Silicon Valley is focused on solving are market-driven problems. If there is a way that I can make a lot of money, then I will put a lot of money behind it. And especially if there's a company that's demonstrated that can build up a huge valuation trying to solve that problem. But if it's a non-market driven problem, then it's very hard to get VCs interested because that's not their job in many respects. And so right now, if you look around the problems that we're facing, climate change being the biggest, there's not a market-driven solution to climate change. And so if you're a venture capitalist, you're irresponsible if you start trying to plow money into it. And so to me, this is where the government has to lead, try and set the incentives, invest, make it more economically viable for renewable and sustainable sources of energy to actually compete in the market.
Yeah, it's interesting. It actually could be a market-driven. You know, if you think about it, the idea, I think the next trillionaire is going to be the person who cracks a lot of this climate change stuff, or healthcare in that area.
I hope so.
And there will be a trillionaire. It's going to be something like that. One of the things that I always say, and feel free to borrow it, like this type of thing develop. It's a joke I always make, which I always say is San Francisco's assisted living for millennials, because the stuff they create here is all those kind of products. You're laundry, dry cleaner laundry. You get your Uber to you, you get your scooter right to you, you get your food right to you. It's constant. It's all about the problems faced by mostly young white men, essentially, like what they need now. And so not a lot gets invested seriously. How do you not force them to do that, but move them towards, say, good uses of blockchain or climate change or the bigger the healthcare that we're facing?
Well, I do think that putting economic resources in the hands of every American will end up amping up investment on solving problems for women, on solving problems that are facing underrepresented minorities in this country, because there'll just be more buying power in every community, and so there'll be more entrepreneurs coming out of each community, and then there's going to be more money trying to invest in those opportunities. Certainly, on something of the scale of climate change, you need the government to come in and say, here's a generational problem, we're going to be willing to support very large bets, because that trillionaire you're talking about, that trillionaire needs to have a runway, needs to have a set of resources to get their start. And as we know, historically, a lot of those resources for these big problems do come from the government, in the best of cases. But I will say right now, it's embarrassing how our government is really nowhere to be seen in terms of the leadership. And you can see this in part where if you look at the sponsors of many of the universal basic income trials, it's Sam Altman, it's Chris Hughes, it's private philanthropists. It's not like the government is going around saying, hey, let's give people money and see what happens. You're not going to believe this, but in the 60s, the government just started giving people money to see what happens. And that, like, when you read about that, you're like, wow, our government actually decided to make bets and conduct studies on this to see what would happen. And today, we're just waiting for Sam Altman and Chris Hughes to report how their data is. That just shows how far behind our government is.
It's also the same thing with space. Like, it's all being done by Bezos, Musk, Richard Branson. So it's all privatization of all the things that government used to do. Do you think government used to jump really heavily back into the idea of space investment and things like that? Those big ideas.
Well, I think we're past the point where if you watch these movies like Apollo 13, you grew up in NASA, we're past the point where the government's going to end up employing hundreds and hundreds of scientists and whatnot. A lot of those scientists now work for SpaceX or the other private firms. But the government has to put resources to work to support moves in those directions that private industry might not take on. I talked to someone who's in AI, for example, and they talked about how the biggest private companies might invest billions to support AI research here in California, but then in China, they have a blank check. They have essentially unlimited computing resources provided by the Chinese government. And so then the companies here say, we have a lot of money, but we cannot compete with the Chinese government in terms of money. And so it would make sense to me that the US government would say, well, we have to maintain US competitiveness in this, and this is some place where the government wouldn't be expected to employ all of the researchers or scientists, but the government could write some checks and make sure that we can stay competitive.
So let's talk about that idea, because one of the proposals going around related to tech, and we can't avoid is the breakup of big tech. I'm of the side that more competition is better. Breaking things up does create opportunities for others. And when you don't have a government involved in helping seed this stuff, it's up to these big companies to coalesce around 2 or 3 giants. And in this case, it used to be just Microsoft, now it's sort of Amazon, Facebook, Google. How do you look at those proposals to break them up?
I think there are instances where we should look at having some of these companies divest parts of themselves, where there's been excessive consolidation. And it's also true now that the business plan for many entrepreneurs is just to get acquired. Like, it's not trying to build the next business that's going to last for decades. It's like, oh, if we become a big enough threat, then Facebook is going to buy us. And that's bad over time. It's bad for innovation. I will say, though, that the lens that some of the other candidates are taking seem to be 20th century approaches to 21st century problems, where it's not like if we created 4 mini Googles that would somehow resuscitate the Main Street businesses of Indiana, or whether any of us would want to use the 4th best search engine. No one here is binging anything. And that some of these markets naturally consolidate to one winner. None of us would ever consciously use the 4th best navigation app. It's like, oh, I want to use number 4 to support them. It's like, of course not. Like, which one's the best with the best data and the best traffic? And so we do need to try and solve these problems. To me, the most human problem that these companies are posing is that the data clearly shows a huge rise in anxiety and depression among teenage girls in particular. That's coincident with smartphone adoption and social media use. And this is something that's plaguing families around the country. And so, to me, that's something we have to counteract as quickly as possible. And breaking up the ownership of the company may not make that any easier. It might even make it harder.
Except that, so there should be just there hasn't been a search engine created for decades. There hasn't been a social media company since Snapchat in 2011, and basically it's the product development arm of Facebook at this point, because they just love to shoplift Evan Spiegel's ideas. So them staying big, like breaking them up does create opportunity, because people would never think of investing in other things. Not the 4th best, but maybe there's a better one. Maybe there's something that can supplant it. So
I agree with you that the way these markets are set up right now is stifling competition, and I would love to try and unleash more innovation in these spaces.
All right, what about other regulation? Do you feel that there should be, tech is one of the arguments that I get from, besides the constant I'm sorry's and we'll do better next time, which we have a drinking game at our conference this year, and we all were super drunk, because every big company came and said, I'm so sorry for destroying democracy, not next time, and we'll fix it better next time. But one of the things they say is we need to be big to fight China. We need to be big, because I think most people consider Russia sort of just a troublemaking, sort of Tony Soprano over here making trouble for everybody. But they do think of China as the big challenge. And so here you have a state-run effort at tech, which is moving global. They're trying to supply all kinds of tech all over the world, in Africa and other places. How do you battle that? Because right now in China, it's a surveillance economy. They accept surveillance in a way that they do a lot of funding of their companies. There's a very tight relationship between government and these companies. How do we do that here? The argument for the Silicon Valley people recently has been, you gotta let us stay big so we can fight China, which is sort of the Xi or me argument, which I don't like either choice. What would you say?
Well, I think that China certainly has some massive advantages in that, as you're suggesting. They have a much more cavalier attitude towards people's data. And so if you have access to
cavalier, that's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah. They have total access to.
Right.
And the Chinese attitude towards privacy is also very different. So if you have more access to more data, then you can develop AI more quickly. Yeah. And that's going to be a huge advantage for Chinese companies moving forward. I'm not sure I buy the, you have to make sure we're huge so that we can compete against China argument in every space. I do think, though, that there are legitimate instances where the U.S. government can try and balance the scale so that a U.S. company can compete on more even playing ground with China, because China, not only is it access to everyone's data at much higher levels, but also their piracy of intellectual property. I was talking to someone who said that there's a Chinese company where each individual employee had access to $10,000 worth of software, and that their company in the U.S. could never have afforded all of these licenses, and it's going to be very hard to compete with those companies. And so to the extent that the government needs to try and even the playing field, that's what we should do.
Is that the country you're worried about most in terms of competition with the U.S. and innovation?
On an economic level and innovation level, yes.
So, a couple more things, and I want to talk just a few more personal things. We'll get questions from the audience. One of the proposals you made is about data, about it being your personal property. There's all kinds of, there's not a national privacy bill. There's one coming online in California next year. Do you think there needs to be a national privacy bill? And also, what did you mean by it's your personal property? You can sell it? Because you can't sell your liver, right? I mean, you can, but it's on the black market and everything else. Should you be able to sell your data? Is that something that you should be able to give away? It sounds like a Black Mirror episode.
Well, I mean, heck, right now someone else is selling it
Yeah.
and profiting from it. And sometimes in the healthcare space, they're selling it, they're reselling it. It can be worth significant amounts of money. And so to me, I'll just share for me personally, most Americans, in my opinion, really, really like convenience.
Yeah.
And I am one of those Americans. And so when you have some of these weird scroll downs, I'm just like, I think the vast majority of you, I just click yes, I agree, get this out of my way, take my data. I hope you don't do anything too terrible with it. I just want to use your service, get in, get out. And I went to law school. I certainly don't spend my time reading those agreements. Like, who here reads those agreements? Nobody. If there's somebody here who's like, I read those agreements. So that's the real life lived experience of most of us. And I think that that would be acceptable if there were a few things that were happening. Number one, if you do sell and resell my data over and over again and make lots of money, or do something that inconveniences me, then I should have access to that information and maybe even get a smidgen of the money. And if I decide that I don't like this relationship and I want to be able to anonymize myself, I should be able to do so. And right now, neither of those two things is in effect in the US. We're just hoping for the best. And the companies, now here's the carrot for these companies. Our data with our buy-in is actually significantly more valuable than it is anonymized. And right now, when it's being resold as anonymized data the majority of the time. And so if you actually get my buy-in, my data can actually become more valuable. And if I get a cut, maybe I actually even can share something else about myself that you would find valuable. So there's a possibility for a different type of relationship between us, our information, and the companies that are benefiting from that information.
So that's sort of selling your privacy. That should be. I've talked about this before. There was an event many years ago where Steve Case was talking about each AOL from customer was worth $50, and I put up my hand and I said, "Where's my $20? Why don't I get 20?" But then the idea about being able to do it feels a little like selling your liver. Like, sure.
I'm more attached to my liver than I am my data.
Yeah, I got that, but it still has enormous power. Should we be able to do things maybe we shouldn't be able to do?
Well, right now it's happening without our buy-in, without our assent, and so to me, that's the Wild West that eventually we would want to moderate.
All right, two more questions and then we'll get to the audience. A lot of right-wingers, 4chan, some others are very attracted to your campaign. You've decried this. Can you talk about this a little bit? They like the money giving away, they like a lot of things, but it's often been linked to anti-Semitic tropes, racist tropes.
Yes, I was mystified and baffled by this when it arose, because I was like, how the hell could you mistake me for someone who'd be down with any kind of white supremacy? I mean, look at me. I'm the son of an immigrant. Like the fact that people in those quarters started to be attracted to the campaign was just a total shock. But as you say, it denounced it, want nothing to do with people who have any kind of racist or hateful ideology. And that's something that I believe people recognize the difference between this campaign and our ideas for the country, and a very, very tiny proportion of supporters at one point.
So what, you just keep decrying them? Because there's a lot. I was looking at it, I was sort of shocked. It wasn't anything that it was an interesting, weird, I almost was like, what are you doing? He doesn't like you. He doesn't.
You should have responded to their post.
No, I'm not gonna go. I stay out of the dominance, but go ahead. It's on Reddit, that's on Reddit.
You and me both.
Yeah, so last question, I think, it sounds like a crazy question, but why do you want to be president?
So imagine being the guy who spent 6+ years helping create thousands of jobs around the country, in Detroit, New Orleans, Cleveland, Baltimore, and realizing that your water was like pouring water into a bathtub that had a giant hole ripped in the bottom. And then Donald Trump wins the election in 2016, and your country does not seem to understand what has happened to it. Your country is scapegoating immigrants for something immigrants have nothing to do with. Your country does not understand that we're in the midst of the greatest economic transformation in our history, the fourth industrial revolution, and we need to get our shit together as fast as possible to make sure this country is strong and whole so that my kids and yours can grow up in a country we're still proud of. So let's say you see all this in 2017, and then you say, how can I get my country to understand what we're facing and advance meaningful solutions in a reasonable time frame before the truckers riot? And then you're an entrepreneur and operator, you make a list, and the list starts and ends with one thing: run for president. And then you look at that and you say, well, if I decided to put my heart and soul into that, do I have a chance to wake my country up? Do I have a chance? And I looked in the mirror and said, yeah, I have a chance. And then you decide not to do that, then you are an asshole. I looked in the mirror and said, all right, like, let's do this thing because I want to be able to sleep at night. I may not win, but I am damn well sure I'm going to make this case to the American people, and I'm going to be able to sleep at night knowing that we actually knock some sense into enough of our fellow citizens so we can start solving the real problems of the 21st century.
And then you'd be an asshole is an interesting one. But is there a chance of unseating Donald Trump? His favorables go up. He's more and more outrageous every day, more and more unhinged. It doesn't seem to have any effect.
I think there's a great chance of beating Donald Trump in 2020. He had to pull an inside straight to win in 2016, and his support has eroded in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, a lot of the key swing states, and he knows it. He's looking around, trying to figure it out. The key variable is who his opponent will be. I think that certain of the people in the field have better chances to beat him than others. I would take anyone in the field over Donald Trump, but one of the reasons why I'm running in particular is that I can peel off many of the people who voted for Donald Trump, conservatives, independents, libertarians, as well as Democrats and progressives in a way that the other candidates cannot. But the data suggests that we have about a 50-50 chance of beating him, depending upon how the economy goes between now and next November. So this is the big question, is which side of that 50-50 bet are we going to land on?
So last question I asked to Buttigieg. If you win, it's going to be a close election no matter what, whoever the Democratic candidate. The Democratic candidate would say to you, it's very close. There's issues around election fraud and everything else. What if if he questions the election? What would you do?
Well, I'm glad to say that even people who are closest to him have said there is absolutely no way that we would not honor the outcome of an election. And it's difficult for me to imagine one individual going against the entire arrayed institutional force of the U.S. government. Our government is not wired to go along with the one crazy person and not the will of the tens of millions. And so I'm sure that he would go down, with some kind of strange racist screed, but he would go down. We would have a new president. And if it were me, one of my first acts would be to go to the part of the country that voted for me the least and tell them I'm your president too.
All right. On that note, questions? Questions. Let's go. I'm going to pick a lady. It's right here. Right here. I don't don't know if you're a lady.
Hi, my name is Kiri Kim. I work at Blind. It's an anonymous app that brings transparency to workplace. And we ran a survey to tech employees asking if they thought the artificial intelligence and tech automation was concerning to employment crisis. And we were surprised to find that more than 50% of employees were not concerned. They didn't think it was a problem. So how, as the Silicon Valley candidate, how are you going to convince Silicon Valley and the entire nation that AI and tech automation is a problem?
Well, I'm glad to say that recent surveys have shown the majority of Americans have now turned a corner where now most Americans think that technology is going to eliminate many more jobs than it's going to create in the years to come. And the conversation or the survey you ran does not jive with the conversations I've had with people here in Silicon Valley. A rule of thumb I've had is that the more someone knows, the more concerned they are. I have never sat down with someone who's very, very deep into the space who's like, yeah, things will be all right. The deeper into the space someone is like Kara. Kara's very deep into the space and she's very concerned. That is much more the norm than the opposite in my experience.
Okay, another question. Let's go back to right here. And then
Hello, Andrew Yang. First of all, thank you so much for talking to us. Putting the merits of UBI aside, I want to talk a little bit about your pessimism when it comes to AI. And obviously there have been instances where you've had massive employment because of manufacturing automation. But you've also had incidences where new technologies have come in, people have protested. This goes all the way back to the Luddites or back to the railroads or even telephone operators in the 20s and 30s, 60s, I mean. A lot of times when new technologies have come in, people's jobs have become obsolete, but we haven't seen mass waves of unemployment. Things like the telephone, smartphones. You might have thought that would have caused a lot of unemployment because of new technology, but it hasn't. So I'm wondering, why are we so pessimistic when it comes to AI that this particular technology change will cause mass waves of unemployment when new technology in the past haven't?
So one needed to take my word for it. MIT, Bain, McKinsey have all done studies, and McKinsey said 20 to 30% of jobs over the next 12 to 15 years. Bain said 2 to 3 times the pace of the last industrial revolution. And the last industrial revolution included mass riots that killed dozens of people and caused billions of dollars worth of damage. We instituted universal high school in 1911 as a response to that industrial revolution. And all the experts are saying this is going to be 2 to 3 times faster, more vicious, affect more parts of the economy. I was just with 70 CEOs, and I said, how many of you are looking at having AI eliminate back office workers? You know how many hands went up out of 70? 70. And you know at least one of them just was pretending because he wanted to be cool like the other 69. But all 70 hands went up. And so they're very, very concerned. You know, what I say is, look, there are 2.5 million call center workers in the United States making $14 an hour, high school educated. Let's say AI wipes out half of them in 10 years. You know, that alone is 1.25 million. And what do you imagine those 1.25 million former call center workers are going to migrate to? And that's an obvious one. There are dozens of inobvious ones that are ripping through the back office functions of many of these companies. So to me, relying upon an historical analog from 120 years ago, if someone walked into an investor's office and said, hey, 120 years ago, buggy whips, they would have been like, what? Like, get out of my office. But in this context, someone busts out a 120-year-old fact pattern and is like, farmers, you know, and you're like, come on, like, aren't we better than that at this point? No offense to the question.
two more questions right here, and then.
Hi, let's move away from the tech into your ideas like great, and I am glad that like you were at least running to bring in new ideas, but you know, going back to how are you gonna try to move these policies forward in a Congress that probably isn't gonna flip in the Senate, and then House is still kind of like, you know, trying to figure out what's happening even today with the resolution, right? So how are you gonna try to move these policies forward when it's not just on you.
Yeah, it's too, I mean, look, the squad's fighting Nancy, and they're all fighting Trump, and then Kellyanne Conway says something stupid, like, how do you fix that? Hopefully it's gonna be gone, presumably,
Yes.
but that's.
Well, we have a very, very polarized society and government, and it's causing gridlock in DC, and it's, it's a disaster. So how do you change it? The way you change it is you end up with a popular wave that ends up transcending political party. You have a person come in who's clearly non-ideological and bipartisan. People feel like they can work with him, and he has a big idea like giving everyone a dividend of $1,000 a month that just is universally popular. Cash is very hard to demonize. If you imagine a world, and it's a very real world, where I come into the Oval Office in 2021, everyone's going to know why. It's going to be because I have been pushing this freedom dividend, and Americans said, heck yes. And so then I'm in office, again, the Democrats are super excited about it and say, let's pass some laws. And then all we need is a tiny sliver of Republican congresspeople to say, the dividend's a good idea, it's gonna be great for my constituents. And if you imagine them fighting it, can you imagine their offices in Missouri and Kentucky and Alabama as they go home? It's like, people will be like, why are you fighting the dividend? Like, we want the dividend. The dividend's a good idea. Like, their office is gonna be surrounded until they say, the dividend is a pretty good idea, let's give it a try. And we get that passed, then we can reverse this mindset of scarcity that has swept the country. It's one reason we're so polarized. If you have a sense that this country is getting dumber, nastier, less reasonable, less optimistic, we are, by the numbers, because 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, almost half can't afford an unexpected $400 bill, and research has shown that if you can't pay your bills, it has the equivalent of decreasing your functional IQ by 13 points, or one standard deviation. So if you can't pay your bills, you're just putting your feet in front of each other, and then if I come say climate change, you're like, I don't care about the penguins, bro, like, I just gotta pay my bills. And so that's where most Americans are. We gotta get their heads up. You get me in office, we pass the dividend, the scarcity starts to lift, and then we can see what else we can get done.
I'm trying to get to every part of this.
Hi, thank you. Currently there are 1 to 2 million Muslims in China who are in camps. And I have heard almost nothing about it on the campaign trail. There are re-education camps, they're taken from their homes, there's, as you talked about, surveillance. So I just wanted to know, do we as Americans have, I guess, any right to say anything about it? And if so, what do we do?
And perhaps to link that with the Washington Post had a great story about how all your driver's license are using facial recognition without your permission. So it's not the same thing, but it's certainly frightening in this country to have your data used that way.
Well, certainly, I believe that the United States should be able to advocate for human rights in any part of the world. But right now, that's a much less compelling case because people are looking at us and saying, are you really in position to moralize to us about the way we're treating this particular subgroup of people? So job number one is rebuilding our strength at home so that we can genuinely say, look, we're fulfilling and actualizing our values, and we'll be much better able to champion oppression of other groups of people in other parts of the world, and that's the goal.
Kara, can I ask a really quick one? Can you tell us
Your
about
place is called Manny's. No.
Can you tell us about your socks, Andrew?
No.
Really?
Yeah, I want to know about your socks.
So I'm wearing some Stars and Stripes socks. They're very patriotic, and my wife bought them for me in
Are
Washington
they?
D.C. at the U.S. Capitol.
Yeah.
They're on. It's like this. You see this red, white,
Oh, you're very flexible.
and so I did the bottom cap
Honestly,
trousers.
if you're going to be a Silicon Valley person, your shoes need to be cooler. I have some for you.
Nice
I like
to
socks. I'm going to get you some shoes. Anyway, Andrew, we can't do anymore. I'm really sorry, but he'll be here. Really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.
And good
Such
luck.
a pleasure.
Okay, everyone. So we have a part 2 for tonight. While we have the part 2, do you mind taking Natalie? Do you mind taking Andrew to my office in the corner? Okay. So Natalie's gonna take Yeah, of course.
But these lovely ladies here have these T-shirts on that say math, and it's make.
Make America think harder.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so Andrew, Natalie's gonna take you to my office. So let's have Natalie escort him. For the next piece, there's a part 2. Oh, not with you. You can stay though. So here's what's gonna happen, guys. We have a fundraiser for Andrew's campaign. Happening right after this. He's going to give us a stump speech and kind of talk to us about what's going on in his campaign, how he's feeling about things, and what's coming up next. He'll take photos with folks, selfies, and he'll be able to meet everyone individually. But before we do that, we just need some help. It's a social justice space, so we're all involved in this together. If you don't mind, if you had a folding chair, just step on the back of the folding chair.